and good evening to one and all. On behalf of my team AP Legal Chambers and on my personal behalf, I welcome you all to the 18th webinar of the series titled Understanding the Native Jurisprudence of India, that is Bharat. I am Anand Kumar and I am going to be your host and the moderator for today's session. We are happy to team up with Bharatiya Nyaya Shastram, founded by Mr. Arvind Kumar, an organization started by the final year law students for the benefit of law students. We have in our midst special speakers Dr. D.K. Hari and Dr. Mrs. Hema Hari, amidst us, the founders of Bharat Gyan. We are very privileged and honored to have both of them on board. I welcome all the participants here. Before going into the webinar, I would like to make a few things clear to all the participants. Kindly mute your audios and if possible, disable the videos also from your end. The session is a completely moderated session, and once the presentation of our special speakers gets over, the APLC's APLC and the question answer sessions would begin. If you have any questions to ask our special speakers, you may kindly leave it in the chat box, and if time permits, all your questions will be answered by them. A short info about the organizers for the event. We are Team AP Legal Chambers, a new age law firm in Delhi NCR, with a branch office in Chennai. We started this journey in 2017, and since then, we are trying to resolve the legal issues of our clients to the best of our abilities. We have been providing specialized services in the fields of domestic and international taxation, IPR, energy laws, constitutional laws, commercial advisory, arbitration, and corporate compliances. We started organizing these webinars out of our passion for law, and due to the tremendous response from the participants, we have been organizing these webinars on every Thursdays and Sundays. As always, once the presentation of our special speakers gets over, the APLC's APLC, Ask the Popular Learned Counsel, would follow. We have prepared a set of questions from our end, and we will be shooting it to our special speakers. I am sure this will be both interesting as well as informative. Now coming to the topic, today's topic is Understanding the Native Jurisprudence of India, that is Bharat. The theory or philosophy of law, jurisprudence. The definition of jurisprudence is the legal system or the theory of the law. The court and trial system used to administer law and justice is an example of jurisprudence. To understand the meaning and definition of jurisprudence, we have to find out the etymology. The word jurisprudence is the English derivation of the Latin word jurisprudentia. The translation of the word means the study, knowledge, or skills with regard to law. Over the course of history, there have been many forms of definitions of jurisprudence. Romans like to call it the observation of all things human combined with the knowledge of just and unjust. Salmon defines it as the science of the very first principles of civil law. It is also known as the science or philosophy of positive law. That there is no one correct definition of jurisprudence. All of these are correct in their own regard. But wait, do we fail to understand that there was a native jurisprudence in our country for over a period of many thousands of years? Yes, we are now here to ponder, analyze, and also introspect about the native jurisprudence of our country, India, that is Bharat. Let me wholeheartedly welcome the special speakers of today. A small intro about our special speakers. Dr. D.K. Hari and Dr. Hema Hari, the husband and wife duo of management IT professionals, are the founders of Bharat Gyan, a civilizational study initiative to compile and present the knowledge of India, its traditions, its culture, its global ties, in short, its ethos, from an Indian perspective. Based on their research, they have authored till date 27 books and produced 5 documentaries as well as many short films that span a wide spectrum of disciplines. The Hari couple are actively in touch with the youth and public through social media such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and blog, with everyday posts on the relevance of the day. The couple have traveled extensively and have found out the civilizations of various countries and also compared them with our civilization. They have also gone on to date the Ramayana, the Mahabharata war, and other important events in the history of India. The Bharat, the Akhand Bharat. We are very glad and very privileged to have both of them on board. Whatever introduction I have given now, it is just a sample, but I am sure you people might be knowing, and I do not want to be in between the special speaker and you people. We are just setting up a stage for the special speakers to connect with you and vice versa. We take this opportunity to once again welcome the special speakers today and hand over the session to them. Thank you and welcome on board, sir and ma'am.
Thank you, sir, for the very nice introduction, and we'd like to thank AP Legal Chambers and the members and friends of AP Legal Chambers for coming in on this Sunday evening. And thank you, Shannon, for inviting us and then introducing us so well. We'll get on to the subject. Probably we'll do about 30-40 minutes of, as you said, jurisprudence, India, Bharat. We'll do some intro on that subject, and then we'll take in questions that you see. Okay, so we'll just, without much ado, we'll get on to the presentation. So our effort here is called Bharat Gyan. It's to experience this knowledge of India. And in this particular aspect of knowledge of India, first thing is let's understand this concept of India, Bharat, and this whole concept of experiencing this knowledge of India. It is just not to read or see, but the concept is more important is to experience. Anubhava, as we say in all the Indian languages, where man has walked the sands of time in this land for well over 8,000 years and more. It's the only continuous surviving civilization of the world. The world has seen over 40 civilizations or more, but Indian civilization is only continuous surviving civilization. That's to our credit, and it's a pride of the land. And we have a variety of ethnic groups in this land. All of them are collectively the strengths of this land. Each of the ethnic groups have left their own indelible imprints on this land. And each have also left their imprints here, which is the diversity, the beauty of this country. If you look at our constitution of the land, we call it Bharat, that is India, or India, that is Bharat. The fundamental question that came to us when we started doing this search of Bharat Gyan about 20 years back was, how did these two names come about? If you look to the northwest of India, you have the Sindhu Nadi, which the Persians and Arabs, when they came this side, they called it Hind. Because for them, in their language then, probably 3,000, 4,000 years ago, the syllables Sa and Her were interchangeable. So Sindh became Hind for them. And that's why it's from that Hind you get the land of Hind, Hindustan, Hindi, Hindu, all that. Even now in Persia, Arabia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, all those places, Central Asia, India is still called as Hind. And that's the way we are referred to there, because that's how it's been there for many millennia. And when this word Hind traveled further west from Turkey onto Greece, the norm there is the H's dropped between Turkey and Greece when it crosses the Bosphorus Strait. So in Greece, it became Ind. And when the name traveled from Greece into Germany and France, it became Indi or Inde. That's how it is. They add an E or a I there in Germany and France. So it becomes Indi or Inde. And from France, when it crosses the English Channel from Calais to Dover and goes into England, they add an A to it in the end. So that's how we get the name India. So when you talk about jurisprudence of India, the first point is we should know how the name India itself came about. This is how, and when the English came to India by ships, what did they do? They gave the name India to us. So that's how it comes about. And if you looked at the name Bharat.
Yeah, but originally all our literature refers to this land and the civilization as the Bharatiya civilization. And there are various versions of how this name has come to be. One popular version is that it is named after the son of Shakuntala and Dushyant, Bharat. And another version is also that it is named after Jata Bharata, who was the son of Rishabha, the first Jain Tirthankar. And if you go into Bhagavad Puran and all, you'll find that this land was called Ajanabham.
Prior to his time.
But the point is, why were these people also called Bharat? Because every name in the Sanskrit language has a meaning. Sanskrit and of course the following all Indian languages. So there is a meaning. So these people were also called Bharat because it meant something. And what did that mean? If you look at it, if you analyze the word etymologically, you have Bha, which means light, knowledge, enlightenment. So this aspect of enlightenment with Rata. Rata means to enjoy, to relish. So to be a connoisseur of, which is why you have the wife of Kamadev, the lord of, the Cupid as equivalent of Cupid in the Indian divinity pantheon, Kamadev, and his wife is Rati Devi. So Rati is somebody who is very delightful. So Bharata means those who relish knowledge, which is why you have so many Bharats in our illustrious lineage of India. And that is why this civilization itself has been looked at. They name themselves as Bharat, meaning a land which relishes knowledge. And if you look at old records where you see the Chinese as well, they have looked at us as the kings of wisdom. Well, they had different ways of perceiving each and the various civilizations that were ancient then, like the Rome. They were the handsome, the king of men, because very robust physique, and the Chinese were the king of people, and so on. So India was looked at, Bharat was looked at as the king of wisdom.
So it is for us, this generation, to take this knowledge forward and share it with the people. Now let's get on to the subject of the evening, which is law.
Now, having understood, the reason we are placing this first is for us to get a feel for what the civilization itself is all about. What is the innate nature of the civilization? What is the very distinguishing feature of the civilization? Is that it is a civilization which has always sought knowledge. The higher has always tried to reach the higher echelons of knowledge. And it is not just the people of this land, but outsiders too have perceived this land and the civilization as a civilization of knowledge. So from there we move on to, therefore, how did this civilization, therefore, such a learned civilization would have had taken sufficient steps to ensure that there was law and order in society, and it was a well-organized society. And it indeed was, if you really look at various structures of the society and so on. And but now we will just focus on the aspect of law here.
Especially Niti and Dharma, the two terms that we commonly use, but let's look at some of them. And obviously this, most of you are aware of this great story of Sibi Chakravarti. It's there all over the net, you can check that story out. But let's look at this one particular statement made about close to 150 years ago by John Mayne. I'm sure all of you would have heard this name, being lawyers would know this name.
Hindu law has the oldest pedigree of any known system of jurisprudence, governs a race of men from Kashmir to Cape Comorin who agree in nothing else except their submission to it.
Look at this, such a wonderful observation. He says, so the people of this land of Bharat, that is India, are law abiding. They submit themselves to the law of the land. One, that's a clear statement he makes. Second, he says this is, as a pedigree of law, this is the oldest system of law known anywhere among the human race itself. And this is across the land. The respect for law is across the land. And the system of jurisprudence is oldest in the world, known to any, it's older than your Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Chinese, all systems of jurisprudence. So he places it in antiquity, one, in the timeline, two, he gives the respect to the people who adhere to it. These are 2 points you get from John Mayne. And look at this, what he says.
It is surely extremely strange that whenever, either in Greek or in Chinese or in Persian or in Arab writings, we meet with any attempts at describing the distinguishing features in the national character of the Indians, regard for truth and justice should always be mentioned first. Now, this is Max Miller in one of his lectures.
So he says this again about 150 years back. See, so we had a fundamental factor of truth and justice was what was the character of this land. He calls it a national character. So justice, having a feeling of justice was a national character. Unfortunately, the last few decades, it has sort of it's shaken. But I'm sure once we understand, we'll get back to it. And the concept of, again, so there has not been one Manu, there have been many Manus, and there's not only been one lawgiver, there are at least about 18 different lawgivers, but only one of them is Manu. So let's look beyond the word Manu, and instantly the word Manu itself has lent in the English language and all other languages to the word man and to the word human. Both these words come from this Indian word. So here it is, this land, when we said about Dharma, which is what John Main also said, if we respect Dharma and safeguard Dharma, Dharma in turn safeguards us. So it's mutual. It is paraspara, as you call. It's a clear give and take. But if you attack Dharma, Dharma attacks you back. So that is what is the basic fundamental foundation that you have in this land. Okay. And if you look at this, from 3000 BCE or 4000 BCE or Rama's time of about 5000 BCE, for about 5,000-6,000 years, this land has continuously of Bharatavarsha, though it has never been ruled by a single king in its long civilization history, has had a single form of respect for law and jurisprudence through the times. The kingdom's shapes change and go on in different geographical forms of the land. But the respect for law and similar system of governance with human respect, this land has had the longest surviving respect for this. No other land can claim it anywhere in the world. Because the country as such, you see the shapes of the kingdoms keep on changing. When the local things change, but as a land, we have had one common set of laws across the land. Whereas we look at in Europe, you see that there have been about 20 kingdoms in different types, taking different shapes, different colors, but they've all made their own laws. Countries keep on changing. Whereas in India, Bharat, we have had a sense of continuity, not just for a few centuries, but for a few millennia. That's a distinguishing factor of the Indian thought of law. And look at the difference between the words king and sovereign. This is a very important aspect. What it says is, the king has no legislative powers, and the laws are made by knowledgeable people of the land. Sitting in different parts of the land, the king can only administer it. Okay, and who are the lawgivers? There are many of them. Manu is just one of them. You look at it, there are many lawgivers across the land, across times. Daksha, Gautama, all these things. Everybody is a lawgiver. That's the beauty of this land. Look at this. There have been antiquity of lawgivers across the land. And even in China, they refer to at least 680 verses of ours. So there have been different people who have across times given us different aspects of law. And as I said, the word, the Manu comes from that comes the word man and human. Manushya, the word that we use in Hindi and all the language. Manav that we use, all the basic root is here.
And fundamentally, this you have to see in connection with the Indian civilization's method of tracking time. So there is one unit which is called Manvantara, and this again has various scales, right from cosmic scales to marking epochs, which are variable windows of time on a societal scale. So Manvantara also defines epochs, and the leaders for each such time windows is also a Manu. So a Manu is one who shapes the thought for a particular epoch. So he is also called a Manu, and therefore there have been various Manus. And how do you shape the thought, and how do you shape a civilization for a particular epoch? Fundamentally by shaping its law, system of administration. And that is what the Manusmriti was all about. And this has to be seen in the context
Overall
of
perspective.
windows of time, because there have been many smritis and many shastras which deal with administration, trade, law, and so on.
So they have not only India, but many Southeast Asian countries, other countries have used inputs from this. So there's not been only one Manu, there have been many Manus. Actually, the word Manu also comes out similarly as Moses, Menes, Musa, all over the world. So it's a very similar concept across the world. And there have been many smritis like this, Apastamba Sutra. So even Yama has given a smriti, Yajnavalkya, Vishnu, everybody. So all this formed the basis of the law of the land, where the Raja and the kings, they administered it. And you can see there are so many people across times who have given more and more voluminous data for local needs as well across the land, be it the south, the east,
The famous Daya Bhaga and all that.
Daya Bhaga. So all of them are given. See, this is from Bihar. Similarly, in the north, Vachaspati Mishra, 5th century. Each one have added to it countries through the ages. Okay, this is from Mithila. You got this? Similarly, from the west. So different parts of the land have offered continuously through the ages. So it is a composite affair. This is, and all this is mentioned in the Hindu law by written by Main. In that it's there. And the Raja was governed by the Smritis. It was not drafted by him or his predecessors, but by a body of intellectuals. And a Raja could never become a law minister. He could only dispense law. That's a fundamental difference. That is why in those days, till about 70 years back, whenever there's a Pattabhisheka of a king happening, the statement that he used to say is, Adandayosmi, that is, I am beyond punishment. And the moment he says it thrice as a part of the ceremony of the Raja Pattabhishekam. What does the Raj Purohit or the Raj Guru say? He says, Dharma Dandayosi. He says, Dharma will punish you. And he also repeats it 3 times with a Danda. So he says, Dharma Dandayosi. So the Danda of Dharma will, so the fundamental point is, in India, the Rajan, the king, is subject to the law of the land. Whereas in Europe, the sovereign is above law. He decides the law, he makes the law, and he is above law. Whereas in India, the king is subject to law. That's a fundamental difference between the thought of Bharat and Europe, you see. And similarly, the concept of rights versus duties. If you see this, we have always spoken about our adhikar. What are our rights? It's been a rights-based society in India in the last 70 years and more because of certain influences. Whereas if you look at the land of Bharat, the jurisprudence, it's always about doing your duty and other things will follow. That is the fundamental difference. So your right is to do your duty. Your right is to do your duty is a fundamental point. That is what the key aspect is. And one of the key persons we see, and this is repeatedly explained by Narada and to everybody else as Vyavahara. The one person in West who made a distinctive shift from rights to duty was when John F. Kennedy, the president, he was sworn in the speech he made when he was sworn in, he asked,
ask not what your country has done for you, ask what you can do for your country. So with that, he changes the paradigm, he changes the shift from the governance and the country to what you can do for your country.
While this was said about 60 years back, 70 years back in US and became a big paradigm shift, as she used the word, whereas in Indian thought, it's been there for 5,000 years from the times of Krishna and before. So that is a big shift that we have in the Indian perspective, where, and look at this, many of our laws that we have today comes from this particular person, Sir William Jones, who is sometimes referred to as the Justinian of India because he's supposed to have given us the just laws. But look at This frieze is very important. It's a marble frieze that you have there in Oxford, where you got 3 scholars. Look at these 3 scholars sitting here, and he is sitting on a higher pedestal, and he is sort of writing the laws for India. Okay, and here is a Mohammedan who is referring to his book and quoting. Whereas look at the Brahmin sitting on the floor, he's also cross-legged. This also cross-legged, but he knows it by heart and he's sort of quoting from it. That's the difference. So here they knew, and they show, see what they show. A student, Jones is a student, William Jones, and here he is sitting on a higher pedestal in comparison to his teachers. So that's when the shift happened. It's a shift from perspectives as to we were giving our perspectives, but we were sitting at a lower level. A person who was sitting at a higher level was a person who was receiving it. That's when the shift really happened. You can see in the field of law. So look at how he says this. Well, every minor detail was prescribed in Indian thought. For every small thing, every trifle was there. That is how the Indian law, and so there was a variety based on need, and as she has always said, on context. The Indian law has always been context based, but it's all brought under one ombudsman umbrella only during the times of Warren Hastings for us. Before that, we had clear separate laws. You can go to the points you want to see.
No, here you have the...
Ingarka? Ingarka, where is that?
No, you have that variety of needs.
So you had different, see the word Shreni here is meant to speak about trade. It is from this word Shreni. If you see, you get all the trades you get. That is why you have got the word Seth, Setya, Chetiyar. All these words come from the root word Shreni because it's all to do with trade, with some trade or calling. So it was all about all that. They had a separate system for familial courts which dealt only with their kula, and then they had a third variety of court that dealt with fellow tradesmen, with the fellow townsmen.
Basically about organized around the town.
Around the town. So that is how you had three distinct courts you had in the land, and it was all finally going up to the local king. That is how the system was based on. And if you look at the concept of jury which you have all over the world, it is said there is a parishad who were constituted to settle the disputes. Like how we got the panchayat, which is 5, very clear the name panchayat itself says 5, and there's a parishad which had 10 people. So both this we had. So the jury concept is very much part of the Indian idea, and it goes back many millennia and referred to in multiple books.
And this is very interesting. They say the duty of the parishad, the jury, was to declare the law where no rule is given in the smritis, and to decide doubtful points of law. So fundamentally, when context had to be brought in, and when the smritis had not given something very explicit in black and white, that was when they had, the jury was called in. And this is mentioned in all the other books on law itself, like Manusmriti and by Baudhayana, then by Vasishta Dharma Sutra and so on.
And look at this, they had the 3, one you had a Purva Paksha. So you take which side, Paksha is a side, so Purva Paksha, Uttara Paksha, and finally you come to the conclusion. So the 3 levels clearly. So all this were very much a part of the Indian perspective of dispensing law across the land. And
This is interesting.
Actually, we made a short film on this. We can just share with you. Look at this. This is about twins. See, here the law of the land is linked to Ayurveda. All over the world, what do you do? When you have twins or triplets born to a mother, what do we say? The child that is born first is elder. The child that's born second is younger, as per modern systems, by method of allopathy also. Whereas in Ayurveda and in the law of India, traditional law of India, what do you say? The child that's born second is elder, because it was conceived in the womb first, and the child that's born first is younger. So when you have to have family, wealth, partition. Who becomes elder becomes a point. So the child that's born later is elder. So system that you have in Ayurveda, science, and that you have in the Indian law system matches. It's beautiful. And this, so this is a comparison between the Indian law and English law. Incidentally, we made a short film on this. It is available in our YouTube channel. You're welcome to go have a look at it. And
We'll handle this first about the concept of Stridhana, which was one of the fundamental points of the entire civilization itself. It is all to do about women's wealth, and many of it aspects of which have morphed over time and have assumed forms such as dowry, and it has led to so many other
unfortunately
wrongs in the society in later times. So there is a general belief that the ancient Hindu law was particularly harsh towards women, because Manu has made one statement which is used ad nauseum by everybody: a woman must be dependent upon her father in childhood, upon her husband in youth, and upon her sons in old age. She should never be free. But people normally only take out just this verse out of context. And like we said, the entire notion of law was context-based. And even this particular verse itself is set in some context. And that is buried in the context of time as well. So all these contexts are removed. And, just this point is beaten a number of times. But if you look at it, Manu has laid down comprehensive principles concerning women's separate property. And even roughly, if you say it is at least 2000 years prior to the English legal system accepting this principle. So the English legal system, the principle, if you see, friends or relations of women who out of folly or avarice live upon the property belonging to her, or the wicked ones who deprive her of the enjoyment of her own belongings, go to hell. So this is a later ruling that came about.
The English principle, English legal system principle.
But in Indian thought, look at what Manu has said. We'll look at a few samples. He allows, so it's known that so when there is a husband's second marriage, the first wife is entitled to supersession fee, sulka, an equal share of property which the husband gifted to the new wife. So legal obligation to maintain the first wife is seen right from Manu's days. Many of them have said. Then there are some other lovely points that come out. The husband again must give 1/3 of his property to the first wife at his second marriage. Then Vijnaneshwara, this is in the Mitakshara in the 11th century. So he says property acquired by a woman through every source, including inheritance and partition, was her Stridhana. So this Stridhana, that means woman's wealth. So she was entitled to wealth and she could acquire it through various sources, including inheritance and partition, as well as her own earnings in any form. And property obtained by women through inheritance, purchase, partition, seizure, finding is her Stridhana. And every category of property was brought under the scope of Stridhana, and the woman was granted exclusive ownership over it. So this is key, exclusive ownership over it. And the line of descent was also very clearly stated. So after the woman's death, it devolved firstly on unmarried daughter, then on married daughter who is not provided for, followed by the daughter's son. The woman's own son could inherit only in the absence of heirs in the female line.
So what it says is, Stridhana, the wealth of women, was only in the women kingdom. Look at this. Animation. Explain this, please. So look at this. A lady, she has wealth. The first wealth goes to her daughter who is unmarried, then to the daughter who is married, and then to her progeny, that is her grandchildren, her progeny. It is only after they've all been catered to does the son get any share in the wealth. So a mother's wealth Stridhana was in the female kingdom alone. That's the beauty of the traditional Indian law. So that the men getting it was far, because you have to provide for all these. That was a fundamental key point here. And similarly, you see this. And he says that thus has been explained the most difficult subject of succession to a childless woman, Stridhana. Even that was dealt with very comprehensively. So the women's wealth was well taken care of each time, and that was it was done. And look at this.
That's Saudaika, actually. So they call this what is obtained by a married woman or a maiden in the house of a husband or father from her brother, husband, and parents. Neither the husband nor the son nor the father nor the brother has authority over her Stridhana to take it or to give it away. And this was called a Saudaika money. And if the husband borrowed this money, he was under a legal obligation to repay with interest. Now, actually, as we go forward, I don't know how much of these are such very profound ideas and design in which show the way the law and the way the civilization was working and was designed to work. It shows how beautifully they were interconnected. We will try to do some justice here in this little while, but you know what this leads to is that one, the woman kingdom had a lot of wealth. So, and the husband had no right or access to it, husband, son, father, whatever, and they could borrow from it and they had to return it back. Now, this means that the men folk had to work. I mean, the whole, there was system was so designed that there had to be a continuous churn of the wheel of fortune. So people had to keep working, and whatever the women held was more like a nest egg.
Safety nest.
So that they could borrow from it, but then return it back.
So look at this. This is a statement by Henry Maine here, who wrote about the early institutions of the Hindus, especially with the married women. And he describes it saying very clearly on Stridhana.
It is certainly remarkable that the institution seems to have been developed among the Hindus at a period relatively much earlier than among the Romans.
So he says, it was the Hindus, the Indians, who gave the wealth to the women, and it was with them much before any other civilization of the world. But what happened was, unfortunately, during the continuous onslaught and later during the colonial thing, this was all turned over. So by the judicial decisions continuously, and bringing in British moral justification. Look at the key word here. The British moral justification and bringing British laws onto the local customs of India. There was a big tampering about it happened because of this constraint what Stridhana was, and that is how it went on to become dowry. While it was, and look at this, they brought in a concept called reversioners.
Reversioners. And upon the widow's death, the property reverted to the husband's male relative. So this is something that was introduced by the British. So while in the Indian thought, it was like from the mother to the daughter, and it remained in the woman's kingdom and more through bloodline. Here they brought in something where once a widow dies, all the property goes to the husband's male relative.
So what happens? Look at this. The moment the husband dies and the lady is without elder sons who are old enough to handle the situation, she is literally at the mercy of her dead husband's male relatives, because if she dies, they get all the wealth. So she is literally at their mercy. So the women who, before the arrival of the British and their reversioners law, was really a queen, and she had the dana and she was a stree. After this law was brought in, what did she do? She became at the mercy of these people who could ill-treat her. Look at this, what he says about this. Come here.
No, this is again the same explanation of Stridhana, but this reversioners law is actually, if you see, is what led to a widespread practice of sati in India during the last...
Ill-treatment of women started only with this. As she said, sati came because they forced the lady to die with her husband so that they get the wealth with them. So that was what was the problem. So it was an alien law imposed on the Indian society, which created so many unwanted ills. And it was blamed on us again. Those ills were again blamed on us. So we were the victims and we were blamed as the perpetrators. And look at this. There was a visionary lawyer by name Dr. G.V. Deshmukh. This is about at the time of independence, and he wanted this to be reverted. Unfortunately, the people then did not understand the whole scenario, and he was actually laughed out of the court. And this is the date of his bill that he had tried to bring in, the Deshmukh had tried to bring in to remove this concept of reversioners. But this was in 4th February 1937. If he had done this, then itself women would have got back their wealth. The dowry problem they faced the last 100 years would not have been there, and women in India would have been much stronger and capable. But unfortunately, Deshmukh was ridiculed, his law was watered down, and it was subverted. Look at this. When we got the Constitution, it's a wonderful document written by luminaries so well, so detailed. We have the largest Constitution of the world by far, written with a lot of forethought and perspective, just held the test of time, drafted by this Constituent Assembly. See, we have taken laws from different parts of the world, from Great Britain, US, France, Ireland, USSR, Canada, Australia. But many of the Indian aspects, sadly, from the native systems were not drawn then, because we were so colonial minded, unfortunately, then 80 years back, that we depended so much on other European aspects of law, whereas we had so much of Indian aspects, which is unfortunate, the practice through the land, that we did not draw so much as we could have, because we have so much of ingrained in Indian ethos of these aspects of administration law.
Briefly show you what those kind of aspects of Indianness that we're talking about. See, fundamentally, it all starts with even how do you portray justice? See, today in law, justice is represented as the lady who is holding the balance
scale. Whereas, look at this, in Indian thought, you have a Nidhi Devan. And the 4 aspects to Nidhi Devan. One is Buddhi, his brain. With that, he gets Vidya, knowledge. So he dispenses knowledge with that. With his eyes, he gives Karuna.
So law is dispensed with knowledge, with Karuna, sympathy, compassion.
And through his mouth, he gives it with love, affection. He explains things to the people. And 4th, with his hands, Kar, Karna, Karam. So the crime is also done with Kar, and the punishment is also done with Kar. So Nidhi is also with Karna. So that's why Nidhi Devan uses these 4 aspects. Whereas this is a beautiful representation of the 4 perspectives of Nidhi Devan. And we have this statue in different parts of different high courts and Supreme Court of India. But unfortunately, the colonial perspective, the European perspective of the lady of the scale does not bring out these 4 aspects. We have so much in Indian thought that brings out these 4 aspects. It's unique and beautiful. We need to slowly educate ourselves and incorporate this in our ideas. And this Dandaniti, the rule of punishment and justice that we have been having in India, in which it speaks about Raja Pattabhisheka to Dharma Dandayosi to go on. So it is
traced back all the way to the divinity Saraswati.
So Saraswati is the original author of this.
And like we said before, there are various works. They are all the works on the aspect of law could be found transcending works on business, trade and commerce, administration of a kingdom, economics, etc. And they were called by different names: Rajashastra, Rajadharma, Dandaniti, Arthashastra, Niti Shastra, all of these. And today you kind of group them as a category of works, and they're called polity. But they were also popularly called as Rajaniti Shastra, Dharma Shastra, and Artha Shastra. So there were umpteen number of works. If you really start looking at works which were in this category, now you'll find so many of them. And if you even trace back, like for us, we always start, even if you say the word Artha Shastra, it always means only Kautilya, Chanakya, and his Artha Shastra. But he, in turn, he traces it to Viduraniti. So Vidura's model of governance and administration, which dates to the Mahabharata time.
That is 5,100 years ago.
And Vidura in turn, he went by what Bhishma taught him, the principles that Bhishma had followed.
His predecessor, his grandfather, equivalent to his grandfather.
And Bhishma in turn, he follows the Ramokya Niti, which was during Rama's times, which was popularized by Lakshmana when he learns it from Ravana, as well as from Rama when Rama teaches to Bharata. Because this Ramokya Niti has its foundations in the Rama Rajya, which is espoused by Rama in Kaschit Sarga in the Ramayana. So where he various rule a kingdom and about law and order and so on. Rama in turn, he traces it to Pushkara Niti based on the teachings of sage Pushkara to Rama. And Pushkara in turn, he traces it to Agni Purana. So, each of these works, you will find this kind of tracing, you'll find the way the thought goes back and back. And so Kautilya's Arthashastra, we know, is about 2,000 odd years ago. 2,300
years ago. Before Vidura is 5,000
This is around 5,100
years ago.
And this is around 7,000 years ago, going by the dating of Rama. And this is even beyond.
Look at this. We have a Ravana's model. So it is not only Rama's, but we have a Ravana's model, and they both match. That's the beauty of it. They merge a lot. They overlap a lot.
And so all of them, fundamentally, they talk about the three goals, Dharma, Artha, Kama. Moksha, of course, does not figure more in these works. And then about 4 methods, the Sama, Dana, Veda, Danda. And it is in the Danda, that is the Danda Niti Sara, forms the basis from which various other works come. And Manusmriti, Bharadvaja Smriti, so many Niti Saras, they all come down from this.
And finally, what you hear is about the Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is a much later work. Chronologically, if you go, no, it's a much later work. But for us, we think it's a work of antiquity. But he says himself it's a later work of his.
And the interesting thing in all of these, because they were all based on Dharma. And look at the fundamental difference between law and Dharma. Because you can't equate Dharma to law. Because Dharma, the meaning itself is much more deeper, and what it achieves by that meaning itself is far larger. It sets the tone to prevent an offense itself. Because what Dharma really means is the character. Dharma comes from dhar, meaning to bear. Dhr, to bear. That's why dharti. So Dharma indicates the character that is, or the innate trait of every living being as well as non-living bodies. So it says that every non-living body, for example, even Earth has the Dharma to go around the sun. The moon has a Dharma to go around the earth. So all of these are things that are distinguish that particular entity. Therefore, when it comes to animals, they have their own dharmas. Ants have their own, lions have their own. When it comes to human beings who have this mind which is fairly well developed, then it brings, the dharma brings in a notion of interactions, context. So dharma then takes on as to a notion of how do you behave in every role as well, in every role, in every context. So that brings in the subjectivity in law itself. It brings in subjectivity on how people behave, how the society conducts itself, and therefore what is to be perceived as right and wrong. So there has never been a black and white as far as the Indian view of looking at law has been concerned, because dharma was ruling everything. And on one hand, therefore, it sets a tone to prevent offense. And on the other hand, it sets the tone to look at it very contextually. Whereas in law, it is more of an aftermath. It sets the tone to punish the offense. That is the fundamental difference that we see between law and dharma as it is viewed today. And this is actually evident because for such a large country with so many villages and towns and colonies.
We have 6 lakh villages and towns and colonies in India. Because we have the pin code of 6 lakhs. So we have 6 lakhs of them.
But we only have about 12,400 police stations. So fundamentally, the society is such that they are, like we saw earlier, they are law-abiding by nature, and even that nature is influenced by dharma.
So we are not a policed society. We are a dharma ruled society at a common man's level, which is what she said in the main slide itself. You say, the first slide we started off, he says, here the people submit themselves to the law of the land naturally. So if we were a police driven society, we would have had to have 1 lakh police stations, which we don't have in this land. This is an important slide.
So having looked at dharma, today what happens is we find in the Indian constitution, we find the word secularism, not only in the constitution, in general public conception, dharma is used with the word to mean religion. But whereas dharma actually means the nature and your behavior, your behavioral traits. So when you say that we are dharma nirpeksha for secularism,
it's incorrect. It should not, because we are not indifferent to morality or ethics. We are to be moral and we are to be ethical. Whereas what it should be is we should be pantha nirpeksh.
Because pantha actually would be a closer word to religion.
Apt word.
Because what it denotes is you can choose any path to the supreme, the central unified idea of divine. You choose any of the path, any panth, and it still leads to the common united divinity. And that is what secularism is all about, where you can respect each of these paths. But if you become dharma nirpeksh, and if you keep repeating this idea to ourselves, then eventually we will, the idea of what dharma really means is slowly vanishing. It is becoming more close to religion. So this is something that
dharma
we have to...
Dharma is not religion, so we should not be dharma nirpeksh. We should be pantha nirpeksh.
And yet another aspect of the Indian civilization is the idea of giving and receiving. There are many distinguishing aspects about the Indian civilization that, few of which we will touch upon now. And the one is, in the Indian ethos, it is the giver who thanks. Whereas the global style is to say thank you by the receiver. He is expected to say thank you. And there is a beautiful story of an exchange between Swami Vivekananda and Rockefeller.
When Swami Vivekananda went to America to give the famous Chicago address, that he stayed on for some more time, there's a particular incident of the business tycoon of America then, Rockefeller. He met Swami Vivekananda and gave him a large check. And Swami Vivekananda did not say thanks, whereas Rockefeller was waiting for Swami Vivekananda to say a thanks for giving the check. Then Swami Vivekananda explains to him and says, in our thought, in the Indian thought, it is the giver who says thanks for having given the opportunity to give to the receiver. So look at the mindset, because only then giving is a sense of humility. So
giving is done with a sense of gratitude to the receiver for giving an opportunity to give. So here you go back into the idea of dharma, the idea of rin, debt, and so on, which is very prevalent in the Indian society. The debt to nature, the debt to your parents, the debt to your ancestors, the debt to the environment around you. So there are various kinds of debts, and therefore a giving is supposed to be a natural task. So you're always supposed to be in a giving mode, and you're supposed to give with a sense of commitment to stay detached from the gift. And likewise, even when you receive it with a sense of honor, because the giver has chosen you as a receiver. So these are things. So a simple act of giving and receiving, if you see, it has so many ramifications around it that lifts it from just a mundane act of just giving it to a much higher elevated perspective itself. And which is why people are very careful. They never give with the left hand, whether be it money or anything, they never give it with the left hand. It is always given with the right hand. And there are various, ways in which they give it, and then, pour water over it to indicate a donation, and the giveaway to show the attachment and so on. But see, this is the fundamental, many aspects in which the Indian civilization stands out unique. So we have focused more on action than reward, right from Gita. We have focused more on duty than on rights. We have focused more on doing good than on what we get in return. on giving than on taking. We have focused more on seva, on others. We have focused more on happiness than on comfort. So even in austerity, we have found happiness. We have focused more on conservation than on consumption. We have always left small footprints, ecological footprints. We are focused on villages than cities. See, actually, what we're showing you here as just simple bullets actually come from a whole body of knowledge on which we have compiled data, which has given us this perspective about the Indian civilization, especially all this that we talk about conservation, then consumption, and villages and cities is based on the industrial model, administrative model, and so on. So these are various aspects on which, therefore, the laws were also, they were taking care of all of this when the judgments were passed and so on. So this has to be factored in when you deal with law of a civilization that has come so long and still continues to practice, because it's a lifestyle model that we can make people aware of as far as how the society is organized, how the society behaves, and therefore how law should be dispensed along with all the various books on law, which the old ones have influenced the new ones, along with modern borrowings from various other cultures. But whatever we dispense, we have to bear these things in mind when we are dispensing that law. There are, for instance, even laws on how crops have to be shared. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for the land, one bottom half for the land, 1/3 for cattle who actually helped you in the agriculture, then the 1/3 for the humans and so on. And even within this 1/3, it went to the landowner, water provider, tiller. So these were all customs and traditions of the land. This is how agriculture itself was conducted. So it was a very integrated society, and all of these figured as part of the said and unsaid laws of the land.
What Hema is showing is very nice leverage, showing that, see, when you have three people involved, one is the tiller, he gets 1/3, the water provider gets 1/3, the landowner gets 1/3. So it's equitable distribution. Being an agrarian society, we were doing that. That's why we were prosperous, sustainable agrarian society for over 7,000 years. Unfortunately, in the last couple of 100 years, we've lost this because we've got other laws alien to us put on us, because of which the bulk of the farming community became poor. So we have to get back to our Indianness, our Indian perspective, understanding all these things. So that will help us again be a sustainable, prosperous land when the laws of the land are in sync with the nature, the people, the attitude, and our ethos and perspective, which will once again make India prosperous, happy, and sustainable land. That's the perspective I want to give. And all this data is available in our Bharat Gyan website. You want to show the website?
Oh, okay. Oh, that one.
All this data that we have collated is available. All this data that we have collated is available for all of you to view and go through in our website. As Mr. Anand had said, on our Twitter and social media, it's available. So all this is available for free reading. Most of it is available for free reading. And also in the books that we have written, authored, it's called the Autobiography of India series. Okay, all these books are called, today we have fortunate to have been able to compile together this Autobiography of India series has 100 volumes. And all this is, most of it is available for free read in our website, www.bharatgyan.com, which is what I showed you here. And this is the Breaking Image Society thing, New India. Films also there for watching. And all this is there, different aspects, the compiled information available, wherein.
So ultimately, it's to bring in not just confidence in India, but also to motivate people to dare to become Indian once again, understand the Indian ethos and adopt the Indian ways.
And then you can go through our website www.bharatgyan.com, where most of this information is available for you. Our blog is also there, where you've got 600 plus articles on the subject. Then our YouTube channel is there with about 300 plus short films. It's all there. It's for you all to go enjoy and relish this knowledge of India from the perspective of law, jurisprudence, and all other perspectives of the Indian civilization as a whole. Yeah, thank you so much. Now, any questions, we're happy to take.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much to both of you. It was really a wonderful session. We have traveled 7,000 years, and we have come back here. It was really
at a jet
refreshing. Yes, at the jet speed. In fact, we have traveled in a Pushpaka Vimana. If you could, we just take a cue from your videos to travel that much distance. Sir, we have a few questions, quite a few questions from our participants. If it is okay for you, can we just extend it for another 10-15 more minutes so that we can address?
We are fine. We are fine.
So we will take the questions of our audience one by one, participants one by one. But the first question is asked by one of our regular participants. Sir, before that, I would like to tell you that we have participants from US also. It is around 9:30 in the morning. We have our regular participant, Ms. Rama Singh from New Jersey. Sir, the first question is asked by Mr. Prakash Kumar. He is one of our regular participants. He is practicing as an advocate at Jharkhand High Court in Ranchi. Sir, he would like to know, sir, what is the validity of the ancient jurisprudence in the current scenario? In the 21st century, dharma, vyavahara, rights, duties, and obligations are diminishing. I think Almighty God is giving alarm signals to humans to rectify their karmas, sir. What are your views in the above question?
Good point, sir. See, everything is a cycle. Okay, we had a clear run of dharma being the rule of the civilization for many millennia. Unfortunately, due to various alien features being imposed on our civilization, the last 1 millennia and more so in the last couple of centuries, we went to a path that is alien to us. First of all, fundamental aspect that we are doing in Bharat is to bring back an understanding of our moorings, our perspectives, our perspectives first of all, because only when we have an understanding of our perspectives will we be able to employ them. Without an understanding, you will not be able to employ them. So that is why we are bringing out all this context. So in turn, each practitioner, be it in the field of law, in your case here, or be it in the case of agriculture in some other field, or water harnessing in some other field, each of us should know that we have had the strengths because of which only we have been a sustainable civilization and a prosperous civilization for others to come and loot us. So we have had knowledge and prosperity, both we have had, and a twinning concept. So that is a fundamental need we need to understand. Then we can take it up one by one, because it is a big ship, and the big ship has to turn around. It has to first of all turn around only with knowledge, self-realization, and activism from the local people. Unless we are active to make it happen, it will never happen. Yes, the scenario is not convenient, not conducive, but if we don't take the first few steps forward, our next generation will not have even this to look forward to. Because we're going to be again masters, to some other masters. If you're going to be the world leader in economics, then you have to be the world leader in law also. And you're going to give your dimension, your perspective. People are coming to you. What is your perspective? You're asking. And if you say, no, my perspective is a British perspective, then you're nothing. Then your civilization, antiquity is of no use, no value. We have to know our perspective first, then to counter and say, I am giving an alternate perspective, which seems a better perspective, which seems more human-oriented, more nature-oriented, more topography-oriented. That is what we have to bring in.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. We will quickly move on to the next question. It is asked by Ms. Anu Dubey. She wants to know, what is the difference between Stridhana and Nari Sampada?
I would think they are just similar words for the same wealth of a woman, but Sampada is one is wealth. It also has a larger connotation as well, various aspects of wealth as well. While Dhana denotes holding, like we saw Saudaika wealth, Sampada also denotes traits as well, the subtler aspects too.
See, Stridhana fundamentally deals with a lady's hierarchical wealth of one family alone, whereas Nari Sampada deals with the whole women folk and how her prosperity is perspective. So while one is focused, the other is a much larger perspective. And that is where, if you see, it is the women folk which clearly held not only the wealth. What is the wealth? Not just gold coins, not just money. It was land, cattle, water resources, and seeds. All these four were with women.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So if you don't have all these four, if these are the four common, most important things for what do you call agrarian society. Water is important, land is important, seeds is important. Without seeds, there's no next year's crop, next season's crop. And you don't have cattle, there's no right from fodder to milk. Everything is dependent upon them. So all these four were in the women kingdom alone.
So Nari Sampada denotes the strength of women folk in general, overall. Well, Stridhana focuses predominantly on her possessions, her wealth.
Thank you very much, madam. While you were discussing about the line of descent for women, we are reminded of the class 1 and class 2 here hires as per the Hindu Succession Act 1956. I think it is taken the line of descent also from our native line of descent. Yes, thank you, sir, and thank you, Ms. Anu Dubey, for asking this question. I hope you would have got the answer. Now, quickly moving on to the next question. It is asked by Mr. Ganesh Ramanathan. What are the key fault lines in our current law systems that are discriminatory and needs decolonization to adopt Dharma framework?
Yeah, see, this decolonization is a continuous process. It must happen quicker. Unfortunately, we lost about 70 years of non-decolonization. I'll tell you why this is. We have three words. We show it in our latest book called Staying Alive. Please go in our website and see there. The first word is Swarajya. And yesterday was the 100th anniversary of Swargiya Balagangadhar Tilak. Okay. And what was his clarion call? Swaraj is my birthright and I'll have it. So we got Swarajya on 15th August 1947. That's about 70 years back. After that, what is the next step after Swarajya? Is Swatantra. What is Swatantra? Swa is self, Tantra is technique. So you have to practice your self techniques. Unfortunately, we practiced alien techniques, not self techniques. So we really did not become Swatantra. When we became Swarajya, we did not become Swatantra. And only after we become, first step is Swarajya, then is Swatantra, then what's the next step is Swavritti.
So which actually means self-reliance. And in the last few months, we have realized that, and we have also heard our PM talking about Atmanirbharta, how and every country, they've all realized what the need to become self-reliant. But self-reliant is not something that you can gain by focusing on it alone. Like we have to be able to leverage, when you say Swatantra, you have to be able to leverage your strengths, your own techniques of practicing. So fundamental, when you say to understand fault lines in our current law system and discriminatory the whatever is discriminatory and things that need to be changed, we first have to understand what are our strengths and then only see if things are framed to leverage those strengths. Do they allow us to use those strengths? So that is when we will get an idea of these fault lines. So I think it's very important first for us to, like we say, build confidence, understand, gain the confidence, and only then you will get the clarity to see these for yourself, not just in law, in so many things, even in industry, in economic model, in healthcare model, everywhere there are fault lines and we have to rectify them. And luckily, these are not like the fault lines of the earth. Hopefully, we can rectify them and, we can then play to our strengths. we always keep saying, you know, India as a society today, we are following models of economy, law, administration, and whatever based on weakness of other civilizations. So because of their inherent weaknesses, whatever other civilizations have evolved as their models of conducting industry, business, trade, agriculture, governance, and so on, or models in society, we are following that and therefore working to their weaknesses, whereas we don't know what are our strengths, and we are not creating models to work to our strengths. So that is the fundamental fault line paradigm shift we have to have first. Then we can tackle each of the different lines.
Yes, madam. Thank you very much. Because in fact, it is a Herculean task. We need to first identify what is ahead, what is the task that is ahead of us. Because over the past several centuries, we have been accustomed to these kind of practices. So it is high time that we unlearn and start relearning our Indian ethical and moral values. Sir,
Absolutely.
Yes, sir. We have prepared a few questions from our end, which we think would be very useful for our participants. So with your permission, can we just have a couple of questions from our side also, sir? Yes.
Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as you have mentioned, that our India, the Bharatvarsha is a continuously surviving civilization on this land. Sir, do you think the jurisprudence has evolved and has retained its core values even after so many years, or it has just adapted to the times and has just taken the values from the other European counterparts, sir?
Number of slides where it was constantly renewed and reviewed and then developed. Unfortunately, in the last millennia, the jurisprudence models of other civilizations have been imposed on us. That is what has created the wreck. Now we have to change it back. And that is, so when you say New India, and you say you want to have Swatantra, Swatantra is what your self-techniques. Today you're not recognizing your self-technique, your strengths itself. So you have to get back to it. So it has to be an effort. When you say Bharat is Swatantra, we have to understand the meaning of the word and say, what are all our strengths and what are our needs? See, our needs, our strengths, we have to play to it. Understanding is very important. Unfortunately, today we have been burdened with alien methodologies, alien thought processes on multiple fronts. All of them have to be one by one dismantled. It's a long process, it's a long haul. But first of all, we need to know what our strengths are, then we need to know what the alien practices are to dismantle. If we don't know both, we'll be groping in the dark, which is what we're unfortunately doing. So one of the efforts of Bharat Gyan is to highlight these as to what our strengths are, and then also to bring forth what these alien factors are, so we know which are the ones we should dismantle to get back to our strengths. Only then we can be a civilization that's going to lead the world again for centuries to come.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, one of the most abused and most controversial theory is the Arya Dravida theory, sir. Arya Dravida theory. So, were there different types of Niti and Dharma or the jurisprudence in the northern parts of India and southern parts of India, or it remained the same?
I think in the early slide itself, I dealt with it. Kings and kingdoms come and go, but the native jurisprudence was similar across the land with local topographical changes in each as per the language and the customs. That obviously it has to be localized, but overall perspective was humanism and linked to nature and Prakriti. That was fundamental factor of the land, and where women were given equal respect, more than equality, they give one step further. It's called complementary. Not equality, but beyond equality was complementary. That was what the key factor was. That kept the society going and the hierarchy running efficiently. We had no major law problems in this land before that. It's all come up only because of adopting an alien methodology on us. So consistently we have had that.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Now, the one question which I am eager to know is, were there any lawyers or professionals practicing law during that time? Like the Vaidyas, the teachers and the agriculture farmers, were there any lawyers?
Yeah, we showed you that slide of Parishad and Sreni, We showed you Sreni, there were different Kula. So all the Kula gurus, the leaders of the Kula were sitting as judge in the Kula bench. And in the Sreni bench, also all the people who are doing trade, the seniors in the trade, they were sitting in the trade bench as Parishad. So everywhere you had the seniors of that community who had gone through life and seen various aspects and read these things and sitting in those benches as Parishad. So yes.
Yes, sir.
See, the other thing is law was not separated from practices itself. So it was so intertwined that people, so to dispense that kind of law, you had to know that particular aspect of the civilization itself, of the society. So industry, therefore, you had those kind of experts who were, looking at the administration. There is a clear hierarchy, where it talks about the local. See, India has been a democracy from even during Rama's times. Janapadas were there. So there were local panchayats. And above that, you had the parishads. And above them all, you had the king who was dispensing the law. So there were very clear demarcation on who would handle and administer law. And there was also very clear demarcation on who would make the law again. So that was with the knowledge commune. So that distinction was also there. So it was dealt with very carefully and in a very integrated manner.
Yes, madam. So the hierarchy of courts or the hierarchy of judicial system was also present, and also the lawmakers were demarcated separately.
Perfect. Very well. Correct.
Yes. Thank you, madam. But I would like to personally ask you one question. It is specifically pointed towards you. You were in one of your earlier presentations. You had talked about the Krishna Jayanti, which is coming in the next week. And you specifically mentioned about the Jayanti word. So can you please explain it for the benefit of our participants, that the Jayanti word, which is also associated with Gandhi Jayanti, Ambedkar Jayanti, Mahavir Jayanti, like that?
Yes, right.
Jayanti is actually, so the way you got Vijaya Dasami, 10th day, the Vijaya is a particular star configuration. Like the Jayanti is also a star configuration of Ashtami. Okay, so that's why you call it Sri Jayanti, you call it Krishna Jayanti. So, but what's happening, because Krishna Jayanti came to be celebrated as Krishna's birthday, from there on, what happened was that everybody's Jayanti also came to be, birthday came to be celebrated as Jayanti. So you got Hanuman Jayanti, you got Gandhi Jayanti, Ambedkar Jayanti, Basava Jayanti. So many other Jayantis also come about. But originally Jayanti, the term there itself means about a particular star configuration which occurs on the Ashtami day, Ashtami night. So there are specific terms for it. Now it's become more universally used across patterns. But all that is, we need to know that yes, there was an original term to it.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Here there is a question by Dr. Devraj Raichur about old laws leading to oppression of certain sections of citizens while Constitution of India. This actually is a very big topic, and there is a lot of misconceptions. Yes, this is how the effect is seen, but what led to it and what lies behind it is a huge topic of discussion. I don't think we'll be able to comment on it so quickly, but that is something we need to really
work on. Probably sometime in the future we can take it up to discuss.
In the future also in our same platform, sir. It will be great if you could just come on our platform and take this issue. Thank you, sir. And we wholeheartedly thank both of you for coming on board and presenting this wonderful presentation about our native jurisprudence. It is time actually to go back and introspect about what are the things which we had, which we possessed in our amongst us, and what are the things which we have lost. And it is also the time for us to again go back and collect those things and come back and make our India a more, what do you call, the place which is dharma oriented and more than law oriented, it is dharma oriented. Yes. The Indic values and ethos of our civilization has to be maintained. And the whole purpose and the idea of arranging this webinar was actually to introduce our participants to this kind of things which we have mostly skipped or forgotten during our this professional, yes, during these hard times. But and this lockdown has given us an opportunity to actually engage ourselves in this knowledge sharing this thing. Thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much, ma'am. Your final thoughts on this, yes, before we
appreciate the effort you're putting in to bring out all this knowledge across so many sessions, 18 sessions continuously. I think your both you and your wife, your efforts should be appreciated in this, and wish you all the best in what the good work you're doing. Congratulations to you.
And fundamentally, if you see the law, the body of people who work with law actually influence the society and the shape that the society is going to take. So it gives it that direction. It makes sure that the society is moving along that path. So it is very important that you are, bringing together people, like-minded people, and then, debating over such topics which can influence and steer society in a good direction. So really, all appreciation to what you both are doing.
Thank you very much, sir and ma'am. It is really an honor for us to receive such a nice words from both of you. And it is today is Adi Perukku, and then it is also International Friendship Day, and we are getting 5th of August where Ram Janmabhoomi Puja is going to happen, and then we are shortly going to have Krishna Jayanti, everything. We wish both of you the wonderful for these functions, and we are also looking forward to have you both on one more yet another session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And,
thank you.
Thank you, participants. And we have got other exciting webinars coming up in the next few weeks. Keep a tab on our YouTube page and Facebook page to get more information on the upcoming webinars. And with these things, it is Anand signing off. Thank you. Have a great week.